Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off in our last lesson because we didn't have exactly enough time to cover as much material as I had prepared. So today we're going to be comparing a little bit of evolution and a little bit of what God's Word has to say about creation. And so we have Ashley, who's on our passage in Genesis 1 to 27, but we're going to go through and we're going to mark out the specific time periods when God created certain things and what evolution has to say about each of those things. All right, so Ashley, please start with day 1 for us.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning. One day.
Okay, so in that passage, we cover a couple of things. First, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And then he said, "Let there be light," and he separates light from darkness. So we see that the earth is created on day 1, and we see that light is created on day 1, and obviously the earth is going to be created on day 1 in that section too. But that's pretty much all the things on our board which we have from day 1. It starts with the earth, which is really interesting because it's not exactly the center of the universe, right? As we've seen from science, we see that it's not even the center of its own galaxy, which is a good thing because then we'd be in the center of a black hole. But at the same time, it's got a special purpose, and God still created it before the rest of the galaxy, right? Okay? And then we have light. And normally we think of light as coming from a source, right? We think of how we get heat and light from the sun, right? That's a big thing, especially for plant life and for our own mental health, because if we don't get enough vitamin D, we're going to be really sad, right? And so those two things, though, were created on the very first day. They're created before we had the sun, that source of light, and the earth before it was centered in its, or not centered, but off-centered in its own galaxy. And so that's really important. Then, do you want to get day 2 for us, Ashley, please?
Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the water." And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, a second day.
Thank you. Okay, so while we don't have anything from the second day on our board, it's really important to notice that God is not creating things which fit into that expanse, but he is creating that expanse so that we have oxygen to breathe, right? So that we have a place to live that is protected. We were actually talking in the car about that atmosphere which God has created for our earth and how it protects us from the sun's rays and how it does so many wonderful things for our planet. And that's what God's creating in that time. He's creating the expanse, the space in which we get to live, right? And so that's really important. All right, Ashley, can we get day 3, please?
Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called earth. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, let's keep going. There's a little more.
Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, with seeds in them on the earth." And it was so.
Okay. Keep going until we get to the end of the day. Evening and morning, please.
And the earth brought forth vegetations, plants yielding seeds after their kind, and trees bearing fruit, with seeds in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day.
Okay. So we see on day 3 we have the plants, which is really important because, now notice this is plants and this is planets, distinction. You got to keep that one separated. But we see plants are created on day 3. And that's because God created all the things which we need before we existed. Before animals existed, he had plants for food so that they could survive once they got placed on earth, right? And humans could survive once they were placed on earth. And he created air so that we could breathe before we were there. Okay? So all these things had to be set up perfectly in order so that those things could be set into their habitat, essentially, and it would be ready for them, right? So we have the plants which are created on the 3rd day, right? All right, we have next day 4, please.
Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater one to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day.
Okay, so in day 4, we finally have the sun right here. Day 4, let's see. And as I have written here, I put planets in there. Now, it doesn't specifically say that the planets were created on day 4, but given the fact that it's talking about the stars, and until more recent years, we didn't, well, more recent meaning like Galileo, but before that time, they didn't understand that the planets and the stars were different, and so they considered them the same things. And so that's why I've put the planets on day 4, because it doesn't say that God created the earth and Jupiter and Mars. It says God created the heavens and the earth. And so then I have associated putting the planets with day 4 with the sun, moon, and stars, right? Okay, and so that's why we have the planets on day 4 right there. But this is God starting to fill his creation. He's starting to place things in the heavens. He's put now stars and the sun and the moon. And these are great things because they guide us, and they also do many other things. Like we were talking in the car with the atmosphere talk, we were talking about this, how the moon is actually something that helps protect us from asteroids and things which are going to hit our planet. It's why the moon has so many craters, because it acts like a magnetic shield. And so when something's coming towards the earth, it says, I'm going to pull it in and take the hit in the place of the earth. And so God placed the moon there for that purpose, to protect us. But it also creates tides, which allow the plant life in the ocean to actually produce oxygen. It produces more oxygen in the ocean than the trees on the land do. And so there's these incredible things. And obviously, the sun helps plants to grow, which is a really big, important thing. And so those things are all really important for our lives. Ashley, please go ahead and read day 5. We're on day 5.
Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." And God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day.
Okay, so now we're really starting to create a lot of things that fill more than just the heavens, right? Now we're starting to fill the earth. We have the animals who fill the seas, and we have the birds who fill the airs. The air. And so we have sea creatures, which were created on day 5, and birds, which were also created on day 5. And it's really important to notice that these animals were created then because God wanted them to be created on a separate day because they have a difference. Now it gets a little confusing when we're talking about bats, which are mammals and also fly, and animals like the platypus, which we're really unsure as to what it is and when it was created. But we still understand that, like, all birds were created on that day, and all sea creatures were created on that day, and it helps us understand how God designed the earth, right? Okay, and then we're going to have day 6, please.
Then God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle, creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth. And God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them.
Okay, so there's two parts to that section in day 6. There's first, God creates all of the land animals, right? Anything that creeps along the earth, which means he probably created bugs that day, unless they're flying ones, but the ones which are like beetles, which are crawling along the earth, right? But one thing about it is we know that reptiles count as things which creep along the earth, right? We don't see reptiles swimming in the sea. We do see snakes, but that's a little complicated. I don't know how that works. But we don't see reptiles flying in the air. Okay, those are two things which we see. And so we know that they were created on day 6. And that's important. But then, I forgot to write this one down, but God created man in a special way. He said, it's going to be the last of my creation, and it's going to be the greatest of my creations, right? He chose to make man in his image. That's something which nothing else in this entire creation has. It doesn't share God's image. And he also chose to mold him out of the dust of the earth. Everything else he just spoke and it happened, right? But man he chose to mold out of the dust of the earth and then to breathe the breath of life. And that's the giving of the soul, right? I think we talked about that last week. It's God breathing his soul into his creation and saying, this is going to be what sets you apart, how you are different from your creation. And then you're going to be set over it, to rule over it, right? It didn't say, oh yeah, I just created man and he was just the last of my creation. It said, I created man to rule over the fish of the air and the birds of the sea and the land animals which crawl along the earth, right? So God created man separately. But then we see, we've got how many days on this board? 6. We don't have millions and billions of years. We have 6, right? Now, if we look over here at evolution, we see that according to their timeline of how things could have worked, we would have had to have the sun before the earth, because nothing on earth would be able to survive without light and heat, right? And it would have been in cold darkness for millions and billions of years because the sun's too far away from the earth for light to actually reach it that quickly, right? And the sun would have been there before light because light had to travel for a very long time in order to reach the earth, right? And that the earth came about at the same time as the planets, because why would the earth be anything special? It's just the byproduct of an explosion. So why is it anything special? All the other planets were created at the exact same time. And we see that sea creatures were created by 4 plants. Why is that? Because the first cells and stuff were created in primordial soup. And that primordial soup eventually became something kind of like water. And so you had to have stuff which could survive in liquid. All right? And plants, well, there are ocean plants. Sea creatures came first because the plants had to evolve later. They had to come about when creatures came onto land, right? And then we have the fact that they see reptiles as being created before birds, or evolving before birds, because they think that dinosaurs became birds. Now, there's no evidence for that, but it's kind of silly because reptiles happen to be animals which crawl on the ground. They happen to have the most dense bones out of any creature in creation, while birds happen to have the lightest bones because they're porous. So we went from densest bones to lightest bones. I'm not sure where that came in. And we went from scales to feathers, and completely different diets, and everything is completely different except for the fact that, oh, Reptiles lay eggs. Birds lay eggs. Okay, so we started with the eggs, I guess. But then we have, okay, well, let's add in our invisible number right here. Man. Man's just the highest evolved being. It's not created. He just happens to be the next best thing. And someday we'll evolve out of mankind and we will have some other thing which is greater than mankind, because we're not the best thing that will ever happen to Earth, right? And then finally, evolution took billions of years to happen, right? It couldn't have happened all in one day. And so, some of the things which I want you guys to notice about this is that we have too complex of a universe for this to actually be accurate. For instance, we have something called interdependency of certain things. And this is what stops evolution in its tracks. It cannot have evolved interdependent systems. And so sometimes we call that irreducible complexity. Okay? It means you cannot reduce it into something less complex. It's something that must be as complex as it is, because there's no possible way to make it less complex without making it purposeless. Okay? And so we look at things like looking at the cell. We can start zoomed in so close that we're looking at a single cell. Now, what's the difference between a plant cell and an animal cell? Does anybody know? What?
Plant cells are more like rectangular.
What's a big difference, okay? So where do they get their energy from? Why are plant cells green? Thank you. The plant cells has chloroplasts. What does the animal cell have that gives it power? The powerhouse is the mitochondria, yes. Okay, so those things make its energy. Now, according to scientists who have a worldview from the evolutionary perspective, the mitochondria is something that was separate once upon a time, because it can act as its own cell. The mitochondria can. Now, the problem with it, though, is they believe that this cell, the animal human cell that has a mitochondria in it today, swallowed the mitochondria in order for it to gain that extra piece, because it's more complex than the plant cell. Plant cells are less complex because they don't have a mitochondria. Okay, there are other things which make them different and separated, but it's less complex because they don't have the mitochondria. Now here's the problem. The question is, what gave that cell enough energy to swallow and catch a mitochondria, which is a powerhouse? What gave it enough energy to do that? Nothing. It had no power. So that's irreducible complexity in action right there. You can't have the cell swallowing a mitochondria without a mitochondria to power it. There's no energy for it to do that. Okay? But then we go a little bit bigger and we find bacteria, which is not much bigger, but still, it's bigger than the cell because it's made up of a cell. Bacteria, though, it can come in single cell, it can come in multi-cell, but there's bacteria which have motors, which propel them. Now, these motors are more complex than the bacteria which don't have motors, right? But here's the problem. There are hundreds of little pieces, proteins, that build up that little microscopic motor. If you take away one of them, the motor doesn't work and has no purpose. So which part of the motor was created first? Why did they get a tail that propels them? Why did they get one of the little hundreds of pieces that they needed to build that motor? If you were following evolution, which is supposed to be like, okay, we are getting rid of what's bad and building on what's good, so if it has no purpose, then we get rid of it, right? Then why would they be grabbing onto a new piece? And then you get into more like larger systems, and we look at the human body and we see you have a heart, and your heart has multiple valves, right? If you don't have all of those valves in your heart fails. It doesn't work. So what valve did we start with? Because hearts weren't originally part of single-celled organisms. So which valve did we start with? Okay, so that's all we have for today.